In order to select a soft-edged object like this dog, we're going to use the Object Select tool to start the selection, but then we're going to need to go in and modify that edge using the Select and Mask workspace. In this case, I want to desaturate the background so that the dog stands out a bit more as the main subject. So I'll choose the Object Select tool, set the mode to rectangle, and click and drag over the dog. I want to make sure that I'm selecting only the dog and not the transitional areas. So I'll switch to the lasso tool and then set it to the first option, but I'm going to hold down the Option key or the Alt key on Windows, and now I get the subtraction icon because there's some areas here that I think are foreground and not really the dog. So I'm going to come along here and just subtract them, and then again right over here, including this area of the paw. Because again, I want to make sure that the dog is selected, but not those areas of transition that have dog and the background. Once we've done this, I'll choose Select and Mask. And on the left-hand side, we have all of our different tools. We've got Quick Select, we've got our Refine Edge Brush tool, a regular brush, the object selection, and some lasso tools. Because we didn't have to actually make the selection before we came into the Select and Mask workspace, but I just find that it's easier to start making the selection and then coming in here. Now, on the right-hand side, if we scroll up, we have a lot of different previews that we can look at. Each one of these has its own keyboard shortcut, but we can also just tap the F key to toggle down through the different views. You'll notice some of the views, like the one we're in right now, this onion skin, it has a transparency slider so we can see more or less of the background as needed. Underneath there, we have edge detection. We can turn on the smart radius, and Photoshop will try to create a radius where it's looking for those semi-transparent areas. So in this case, the fur of the dog, and it's trying to be smart. So if there were some areas, like say, for example, it was a person and they had hair, but they also were wearing a leather jacket, it would be smart and not try to find blurry areas around the leather jacket. So I'll enable that and then just increase the radius a little bit. But now I'm going to need to go in with the Refine Edge Brush tool in order to refine some of the areas of the fur. So I'm going to paint right around the top of the dog. I'm just trying to define those furry areas a little bit better so I can pick up a few more strands of hair. But you'll notice when I went over this area here, well, it knocked out some of the fur. So I'm going to switch to the brush for a moment because that is definitely dog. I definitely want that as part of my selection. So I'm just going to paint over it with the brush. Then I'll switch back to the Refine Edge Brush tool, and we might want to take some time and go down here over the tail area. And while it might look like I'm subtracting too much, you have to remember that when you're in the Select and Mask workspace, the mask is really only showing you what's 50% or more selected. So it's a little bit difficult to see the mask. So I'm going to go ahead and go with what it gives me. It might need a little bit more refinement in a minute. But before we exit out of here, let's look at some other options. These global refinements, they're super convenient if you've got a hard-edged object, and the output settings, you should just know that we can choose to not only output to a selection or a layer mask, we've also got a new layer and additional options here. So I'm just going to output to a selection. And then because I actually want the background selected, when I add my hue saturation adjustment layer from the bottom of the layers panel and we start desaturating it, instead of desaturating the dog, I'm going to switch to the mask here, scroll down, and then click invert. Now we can see in some areas like here around his head, he's done a really nice job of picking up all of those small details, but there are some areas like right down here where I might need to switch to my paintbrush, get a little bit larger of a brush, and maybe decrease the opacity to maybe 50% by tapping the 5 key. And then, depending on whether or not I'm trying to hide or reveal the adjustment layer, I either need to paint with black or white. So here, I actually need to paint with black in order to hide the adjustment layer in that shadow area of the dog's paws, and right along here as well. You'll notice that I'm painting multiple times in some of these areas, and that's because I've got my brush set to 50%. I can slowly build it up. But right down here, it looks like I've got a little overspray, so I'll tap the X key and then just paint in those areas to remove the saturation. So it's really just a matter of toggling between your foreground and background colors, the black and the white, in order to paint in and paint out that adjustment. Excellent. I think you can see that even though the dog is really furry, the Object Select tool and then using the Select and Mask workspace really made it quite easy for me to select him and restrict the changes of the adjustment layer to only the background.